Hey guys, today we're going to be talking about AngularJS. AngularJS is a pretty new JavaScript library. It introduces a lot of really cool techniques that you can use. A lot of them are very wide and broad in the variety of what you can use them for. But as you can see here on W3 School's homepage, one of the big things that they like to advertise is that it's really good for single-page applications. You'll be able to see that as we get into some of the details here. I want to start off by saying that since this is the last topic of this semester for our Introduction to Web Development class, I'm going to be keeping it a real introduction. I'm not going to be going through every feature of Angular. I'm going to be stopping at filters. In my experience, this is what I would consider, these topics here at the top, what I would consider those a pretty good, solid foundation of understanding Angular. Honestly, Angular can go really deep. You can teach an entire class on it. So I just want to focus on the fundamentals and getting started with it. So this is going to be a quick video, I hope, but it's also going to focus on quality over quantity. So I'm going to try to teach you some of the very main concepts that you can use to really understand what Angular is all about. So I'm going to just dive right into it here. Keep this window open just in case I need it. This is my web dev repository from GitHub, and I have one tiny little project called, if I can find it, Introduction to AngularJS. So make a copy of that on the desktop. So this is one of the smaller applications, just 3 files, and I have a page of stuff. And so hopefully all this stuff is going to be able to give you guys an idea of how to use Angular. So I'm going to open this up, my HTML file, and we're going to start up at the top with how to get started importing Angular itself. So here is something you should be used to seeing from when we imported the jQuery library. You can find any valid source for the Angular library online, or you can download it yourself and refer to it locally, but in the end you just have to have a copy of Angular. So that file right there, angular.min.js. So that line imports Angular. We have the usual, our own style sheet and our own script file. So the thing about Angular that's really neat is it actually extends HTML. So it adds properties to HTML that weren't there before. The very first one being this ng-app. All of the Angular attributes that are added to HTML are kind of referred to as directives. So that's going to be a word that I'm going to use a few times. So when I say directive, it really means an attribute on an HTML element that now means something since Angular has been imported. And to just to kind of keep this simple without getting too conceptual, ng-app is just saying I'm creating a scope for an Angular application. So that's what app means. It means application, and it usually looks just like that. There are complicated situations where you need more than one, but I'm not going to talk about that. So we'll just for anytime you're using Angular to begin with, just take your outermost div and put that ng-app on the outside, and that means everything inside of the div is kind of part of this Angular application. So I'm going to ignore this one for a second because we're going to come back to that. So I have a header file here at the top, I have a big header here at the top in H1, and then under that I have a divider, and I can see in my styles that my divider is marked up as something that it's just a div that looks like a horizontal row. So if I look in my DOM here, expand this a little bit, there's my H1, there's my divider, and I have an H3 that says basic data binding, and a div that says username. So nothing special yet until we get down to this guy, this input. So this text box right here. So I go back into my markup, and so this username here, this input, type equals text, so it's that text box. It has a directive on it called ng-model. So this is cool. ng-model, what it does is it doesn't actually produce any visible behavior on the text input As you can see, there's nothing really special about it. What it does, though, it's kind of like declaring a variable, sort of. It's marking this input as a data model. And the reason that you want to mark something as a data model is because something else somewhere in your application is going to use the value of that model for whatever. So what I'm saying here is whatever I type in to this input on the screen, I'm going to want to use that value somewhere else on the page. And I'm going to refer to it by the model name. So I'm marking it as a model. I'm saying this is the username. So that in and of itself doesn't really do anything. Let me close that. But as you can see here, we do have the ng model username on it. So when we actually do something with it, is you can see right underneath the input, I have a div which says ng bind. So ng bind is something that you can use in combination with a model in Angular to say, I want to take the value of the model that I'm referring to here and get it and put it right in the middle of my value of my element. So this actually binds the value, the inner HTML of this div to the value in the model. So even though this div is empty, you can see there's nothing inside of it. It's just empty. It's going to bind that value to the value of the model. And the great thing about it is it does it in real time. So while I'm typing in there, it's constantly listening to the changing value of the model. So anything bound to the value, so no matter what I type in here, whatever, it's everything that's bound to the value of that model is going to get updated in real time along with it. So that's really, really simple and useful. So that's just getting started with what Angular can do. That's just the very basic aspect of data binding. So you have a model, and then you have things that can bind to the value of the model. So that's cool. That's the basic data binding. Next part is using controllers. So remember I said a second ago I was going to skip over this directive up here, ng controller. Well, what does it mean for me to say I have a controller called person controller? What that means is that if I open up my scripts, my own scripts here, notice I have declared a function with the same name as the controller, and it takes in a scope, and that looks like, that looks similar to like a jQuery thing with the $sign, but this is actually, an Angular object. So it takes in this scope, and the scope is exactly what it says it is. It's a scope. It's supposed to be like the root object of an entire area of memory, an entire context of memory. So what we're doing here is not only are we creating this scope, but we're binding it to be able to be used in the HTML. That's the important part. So here in the HTML, now everything inside of my app, my jQuery app node, has access to be able to refer to all the things inside of the scope that are in my JavaScript. I know that sounds hard to understand just by saying it, so hopefully we'll show it here in the next example. So using controllers, this is a very simple one-line example of what I just meant when I said that. So my div says the current time is, and then we have this weird notation of 2 curly braces wrapped around viewModel.currentTime. So once we break down what this thing means, you should be able to understand what an Angular controller does. So first of all, the double curly brace is an Angular expression. So what that tells Angular to do is take what is ever in between the double curly braces and try to evaluate it. So that's pretty simple. You can even put, like 2 plus 3 or anything like that. But the real power of the expression is that it has access to everything that is in the scope of the controller. Notice I have viewModel.currentTime. Well, how the heck does it have any idea what viewModel means? There's nothing anywhere around here that says anything about a viewModel. I have no idea, what is that? What is viewModel? The reason it knows what that is because it has it has a it has visibility to the scope of the person controller. And if we go back and look at our person controller, everything that is inside of the scope object is accessible to that expression that we were just looking at. So anything inside of scope, whether it be a method or a variable or anything, is accessible in the expression. And notice my very first line of code, what am I doing? I'm creating a view model object inside of my scope. So since I've created a view model object inside of my scope, back here in the HTML, that's why we know what the view model is, because the view model is an object that exists inside of the scope of the controller. So hopefully that kind of brings it all together. Anything that you put on that scope object is going to be accessible inside of these expressions, which makes it really, really powerful. So for me to go and look at scope.viewModel.currentTime, that I have actually just given a value of the current date time. So if I refresh the page, it's showing the time. So that's really just exemplifying that we can, first of all, it's introducing this syntax for expressions in Angular. Second of all, it's showing that we can use the controller to access anything that's inside of the scope. Inside of this expression, we can refer to anything inside of the scope. So that's really cool and really powerful. We can write, gigantic object graphs, or we can code anything we want in the JavaScript area, and then as long as it's within the scope of our controller, we can use it to put data on the screen and do anything we want on the content layer. So this is kind of really cool. So that's a simple example. We're going down to, this next one is actually a combination of the previous two. So here we have an input, and I've said I'm going to be a model. So anything, okay, so this is cool. So back up here, I said my model is username. So anything that binds to username is going to automatically get the value of that, even as it changes. But here, I'm doing something a little different. I'm saying this is a model, and the model is viewModel.firstName. So the difference is, in this case, I'm using, instead of just creating a model on the fly that has nothing to do with the scope of my controller, right? Username is not, if I go back here and I look inside of my controller, there's nothing in here about username. It doesn't say a username anywhere. So in this case, you can actually just on the fly create this model that is going to exist and be bindable by anything else, like we do here. But in this case down here, we can create a model that is at the same time referring to an aspect of the controller. So this you see a lot, I think, a lot more often. I can't really say because Angular is so new, it's hard to say what's standard in the industry. But in my experience so far, most people rarely have something that's just kind of whipped up on the fly in the HTML. They usually have it bound to something in a controller somewhere, just because it's a little more organized. So here we have a text input that is saying I'm a model, and my model is a piece of the view model first name. And another text input that says my model is the view model last name. So these two guys over here, oops. So those two elements right there, those are models that are associated with those text inputs, but at the same time they also have initial values because I've given them initial values here in the initiation code for my person controller, initialization code. So when I get down to here, this next div, this is kind of where it all comes together for this example. So I'm able to make an expression that says I want to look at the view model first name, and then I want to concatenate it with a space, and then concatenate that with viewModel.lastName. So that is going to basically show my name on the screen because this guy here is data bound to whatever is in that value. So this is a controller data binding. The view model is an object that's in the scope of the controller, right here, and first name is a property of that view model. And then likewise, this guy here is also a variable that's part of the view model, which is an object in the scope of the controller. Now the difference here in this example is that I have the model bound also to an input. So that's the big difference. The big difference is that once you say, hey, this guy is a model, that means the moment that his value changes, everything that's referring to viewModel.firstName, its value changes. So long story short is that even though here it says Donnie Santos, if I change this changes as well. So here in this example, it's a combination of the first two examples, and in this case we get the best of both worlds. We have, the initial value is coming from here, but at the same time we get that changing behavior, that dynamic behavior. The value keeps changing as we keep typing because it's also bound to the text inputs. We've defined the text inputs as models, right? So here's a model, here's a model. So it's bound to the view model and getting its initial values from the view model, but at the same time it's watching these two models for value changes. So this is an example. It's a little more realistic example because this happens a lot. So this is kind of an example of the first two and how you can do both at the same time. You can have data binding and controllers. That's kind of the norm actually. You have controllers and you have usually a view model that's representing the data that's on the screen, and you have data binding going on. So that's kind of, I think I talked too much about that actually. That's all pretty much the same concept, controllers and data binding. Now down here we get into some of a little more, I guess I'm not sure if this is like bells and whistles, but it's a little bit, this is like the fundamental aspects of Angular right at the top. I mean, just understanding that you can create these controllers, have access to the scope in your JavaScript, and go into your HTML and still be able to write these expressions that refer to the values in your scope object. That's really that's the big learning curve that it kind of takes to understand what's going on in Angular. Once you get that, this stuff down here is just kind of bonus. So a controller method, this is kind of a no-brainer, but just like I can put a object or a variable on my view model, I can also put a method or a function on my view model. So here I've declared a simple adder function, put it right on my view model, and this is just demonstrating here that I can say in the middle of my div, the sum of 2 and 3 is, and here I'm invoking inside of an expression my method. So remember, since the only way that you can get access to the stuff in the view model is by using this expression syntax, because view model doesn't mean anything unless you're referring to the controller. So this here, this ng controller directive is what sets up access to be able to have visibility to all of the things inside of the scope object. So down here, the sum of 2 and 3 is, so here's our expression. We try to evaluate everything inside of the expression. It knows what view model is because we've declared the person controller in the ng controller directive, and view model is an object within the scope. So therefore we can simply call viewModel.add 2 and 3, and this whole thing, because of the expression, is going to resolve to 5. And it's not really rocket science here. It just says on the screen the sum of 2 and 3 is 5. So let's take a look at the markup behind that just to see what it looks like. So it says ng binding. Notice there's an ng binding class on that. It's a little Angular magic. The sum of 2 and 3 is 5. Okay, so now we get to some fun stuff. Another divider. So the repeat directive, this is really fun. So ng repeat. With ng repeat, you can do basically what looks like a for each loop. Let me break this down a little bit so you can read it a little easier. So I have a div, and inside my div I have an expression. So the ng repeat directive takes one value and it says item in viewModel.list. That looks a hell of a lot like a for each loop. So viewModel.list, well, what's that? We can start by just going into my controller code and saying what is viewModel.list. So you go back over here, viewModel.list, and there it is. We found it. And as we can see, it's an array. It's declared in JavaScript notation or JSON notation. It's an array of objects, and each one of these objects has a name and a value. Right? So I can see here it's a list, and each item in the list, each object in the list has a name and a value. Item 1, item 2, item 3, 100, 200, 300. Coming back to the code, my expression, well, before I get to the expression, so this syntax here in ng repeat, it looks in the value. This is a keyword in. So the thing on the right is the collection that we're iterating through. It has to be an array. And the thing on the left is the name of, it's the formal parameter name of the variable that we're pulling out of the collection at each iteration. So this is actually going to create 3 divs, one for each item in the list. And this is how we're referring to the current object at each iteration. So it's literally going to create 3 divs, and each one's going to have the name followed by a space followed by the value. So we come back here, we see that's indeed the case. Inspect the element, and let's see here. So you can see there's some comments in here. It's telling you that it's doing a repeater, and there's some, like I said, it's kind of marked up with this Angular magic that you don't have to worry about too much. The most important part is that it's actually receiving the item 1, 100, item 2, 200. So it's clearly creating these 3 divs that we wanted. Let's see, do I have to say anything else before I move into filters? I think that's it. So filters, and this is the last thing I'm going to talk about before I guess I'm going to just talk about Angular conceptually for 1 minute before we stop. With filters, you can do things like this. So this is pretty much the same exact repeater that we just did. But in this case, I say, go through all of the items in the list, but now I put this pipe after the collection, and I say order by name. So by putting that pipe at the end, and on the right side of the pipe I say order by name, that's going to, guess what? It's going to sort the list in alphabetical order by the name. And as you can see on the screen here, item 1, item 3, item 2, because these are now in alphabetical order. So that's really powerful. You don't have to write any sorting code. And I did the same thing here with a different filter. Item.name, item.value, but this time I put a pipe at the end of the string and I said, hey, lowercase everything, and it magically just lowercased everything. So we can actually go back here to W3 Schools and look at filters. You can currency filter things, you can lowercase them, you can do it order by, uppercase. So there's a bunch of different transformations and sorting things that you can do on your repeaters or any data on the screen at all, actually. So this is some functionality that comes out of the box with Angular. So let me see. That's, those are kind of the main aspects of the functionality that I wanted to show you guys. I really just want you to be able to do basic data binding so that if you open up an Angular app someday, you can see this and you can be like, what the heck is all this ng dash stuff? And, you might be looking at something like this and saying, what the heck are these curly braces? And I don't understand where view model came from. I think the biggest hurdle, the most important thing to understand is making that transition from understanding that here we're declaring a controller, and inside of the controller we have a scope object, and everything inside of that scope object is now accessible inside of all of this HTML. So that's really cool, and really it's kind of confusing actually. It's even confusing to me a little bit. I have to think about it really hard for it to make sense. And it won't make total sense unless you open up the Angular code, which we're not going to do. But that being said, it's still a pretty good intro just to understand what Angular can do. So I think that's a good start. I guess I wanted to say one thing about why Angular is good for single page applications, and what might you be able to use it for. So I think Angular does a couple of things that are really good. Let me go back here for a second. So, and I encourage all of you, before I say this, I encourage all of you to go through all these different examples. Like, you might go over to controllers, and they have like examples for all this stuff. So you can play around with this stuff and see they're doing pretty much the same stuff that I'm doing verbatim. So yeah, I would probably right up to filters. I would kind of go through all of these examples and just try them out and kind of figure out what you can do. I taught myself Angular in one day just by reading W3 School stuff, so it's pretty good. So they kind of said from the beginning, oh, Angular is what you want to use for single page applications, right? So right there. The reason Angular is really good for single page applications, I think, is because you guys might have actually encountered this a little bit with your final project, where we're handling most of the page changing and just dynamic content on the client side, instead of the server saying, hey, here's a page, here's a different page, here's another page. Well, when you're hitting the same page on the server every single time, how are you going to manage a site that has like 10 different views if you're hitting the same page on the server every time? It would kind of be pretty tedious if you constructed this big. I think probably what some of you are doing in your final project is saying something like, oh, have the server just tell the client when it's time to move on to the next page. And that's kind of tedious, even with 2 pages. So imagine if there were like 20 pages. Angular is really good because what you can do is you can set up your view model to be this object graph, whatever kind of object graph you need, right? So your view model can have a list of pages, or a list of objects that contain data that is necessary to populate various pages. It can contain stateful information about like what page you're on. You can make an enumeration that designates a workflow. You can do all kinds of things. Once you kind of leverage JavaScript to be the controlling factor for the workflow of your page, I think that's what you obviously really need to do with single page. You can do something where the server does indeed control workflow, but it's often the case that you need the client to control workflow as well. There's examples of both. So I think Angular does a really good job of giving you the power to have the view model really inside of your controllers match exactly what the structure of your pages are and the workflow of your pages in a way that isn't really tedious, because Angular offers you the ability to do data binding with controllers and models really without a whole lot of pain. So I think that's kind of its the strongest thing that it has going for it. I don't recommend that you guys try to use Angular for your final projects because it takes a little while to get used to, but I definitely encourage you to maybe make an application for fun, or maybe after the class is over, go back and try to do the final project again using Angular in your spare time. Definitely don't do it in the next 2 weeks, but maybe after the class is over if you have some time. Maybe between now and then I can come up with like an example of how you might design the final project, or at least an aspect of it, using Angular. Since it is indeed a single page design, I think that might be a good idea. This is the first semester that I've taught this class, so I'm still kind of building up my code base in GitHub. I'm still kind of trying to refine things. It's still going to be changing, certainly, between now and next year. So some of these lectures I definitely need to go back and refine. Some of the code examples I need to add to them or refine them. So it'll be a learning experience for me too. And quite honestly, this is the first time I've ever tried to teach anybody Angular. So the first is always the worst. I'm not sure what parts of this will make sense to people. I've never got the chance yet to look into somebody's eyes while I'm trying to teach them Angular and see if they're utterly confused or not. I've been teaching web development for a long time, but this is the first time ever I've tried to teach Angular, and it's an online class, so I'm not really able to gauge your reaction to it. So, forgive me if this is still kind of crude and has a lot of room for improvement, but please provide me some feedback as to which parts of this make sense and which part is confusing, or if any of you have read forward in the W3 Schools lectures to see if maybe some of it you think I should add. I thought it was pretty good to just stick with this for now, but if you think that any of the more advanced stuff is not too bad and I should include it, I would do that too. So once again, just a few examples of how to use Angular here. I'm going to try to give you a pretty simple, straightforward assignment, and I'll try to not make it too hard. And please direct any questions to me if you have them, and I'll probably create a thread on Blackboard as well for Angular discussions, just because it's kind of off the beaten path. So thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you soon.